This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.
Do I wait for the bumper, or do I just... Oh, okay. Hi. Welcome back to Energy Visions and to Politico's event on the EU's carbon removal gamble. My name is Jan Chański, and I'm the Senior Policy Editor at Politico, and I'm in charge of many of the reporters who you hopefully interact with covering this area. You're watching Politico Live, which is the live extension of Politico's unbiased journalism. And today we'll be talking about carbon removals. It's a crucial part of the EU's long-term climate strategy. If the world had taken global warming more seriously a few decades ago and had cut emissions faster, there'd be no need for today's panel. But it's clear that greenhouse gases are being cut too slowly, and renewable energy, which is making interesting progress, is just not coming online fast enough to spare us the worst effects of climate change. Current policies put us at about 2.7 degrees of warming by the end of the century. That means the carbon being pumped into the atmosphere has to be removed. There's lots of ideas on how to do that, from trees and changes in land management to carbon capture and storage, and newfangled and economically doubtful ideas about pulling CO2 directly from the atmosphere. Last week, the Commission put forward its carbon removal certification mechanism proposal that aims to encourage the creation of a carbon removal market. But getting the system right isn't going to be easy. Over the next half hour, we'll be taking a look at the proposal and what needs to happen for it to work. First things first, we've got a few housekeeping remarks. I'd like to thank our partner Shell for making this event possible, and I'd like to thank the audience, both here in person and online, for joining us today. We like to make our panels as interactive as possible. We don't take live questions, but you can participate by tweeting at LivePolitico and ask questions via Slido using the hashtag EnergyVisions, and make sure you select a room called Politico Spotlight. You know who we are, and I'll be prioritizing questions that are sent with a name and organization so that everybody knows who the question is coming from. It's now my pleasure to welcome our panelists. We've got Christian Holzleitner, Head of Unit C3, Land Economy and Carbon Removals at DG Klima with the European Commission. And Frida Sund-Falkevik, the Environment Attaché with the Permanent Representation of Sweden to the European Union. Right here. As a reminder, Sweden takes over the Council presidency as of next month. Thanks very much for agreeing to the panel. We have a short and tight panel today. I'd like to begin, obviously the news was last week, the presentation of the Commission proposal. Maybe I'll start with Christian. What are the highlights, the takeaways that we should take from last week's proposal, the main points?
Yes, this is a first step, and as I already also said before in the panel, I think the right mindset for that is thinking about this is about starting up carbon removal. So this is a startup business. This is not like any final policy on carbon removals. This is about understanding better the costs, benefits, risks of the different carbon removal solutions. We have permanent storage, geological storage. We have carbon farming, about better managing our soils, our forests. And we have the emerging field of storing CO2 in products and getting more conscious about that, like in construction materials. And so our proposal is a tool on monitoring, reporting, verification. So can we, with a sufficient level of certainty say how much carbon is stored for how long and how sustainably. This is what we want to answer with that proposal. And I would hope that it's kind of a no-regret proposal, because irrespective of what you think about the future policy of the European Union should be for carbon removals, you first need to know what you are talking about. And so with that, we want to provide more trust, more clarity, more transparency.
Great, thanks. Frida, what were the big takeaways for you from last week's proposal?
Well, first of all, that it's a very interesting proposal. I think it indeed opens the door to a wider discussion on what should the role of carbon removals be in EU climate policy. That is a bit outside of the scope of the current proposal, but I think that goes back to what Christian said. This is a first step, and I think we will have very interesting discussions around the proposal.
There was a firestorm of criticism which hit before and then right after the policy was announced. I'd like to address a few of those, and maybe we can sort of tackle them. And you mentioned, Christian, some of those in your initial comment. Permanence of storage seems to be a really big one. Both sort of, I guess, land use. You get a forest fire. Everything goes back up in the atmosphere. How long a piece of furniture lasts. All that sort of thing. So what are the big ones for permanence when the Commission looks at this?
Yeah. So, as so often in climate policy, we need every solution. We need the permanent storage, but we also need to get better at managing our forests, our soils, and also to use products more long-lasting and also become more aware of the carbon that is stored there. So for geological storage, we have the rules of the CCS directive, and that's kind of the gold standard for permanence. I think those rules may be a bit too demanding for a forester or a farmer who wants to get into carbon farming. Yeah? But of course, we also need from a farmer forester the commitment to do it for a longer time period. So I think there it's not so different from organic farming. Huh? It's also a process. You need to commit to do it for a certain period, and then maybe you decide, okay, it's not for me. Right. But then we must be very honest that, okay, if you stop it, if you stop monitoring it, then you have to assume that the carbon stored is back to the atmosphere. So we have to be very clear about that, about for how long our certificates will be valid. And we have to be very clear that permanent storage, geological storage, is something very different from carbon farming or from the storage in products. And I think there we go further than any other certification scheme. That
for the geological permanent ones?
For everything.
Right.
Because like for carbon farming and so on, most do this fudge and say, yes, it will go well. So once you start it, this will stay there for centuries. And as you said, there are high risks for how you do it. And we want to be very clear, our certificates will only be valid as long as you monitor and as long as you take liability for any re-emission.
So just as a functional question, you're a farmer or a forester, you get into this scheme, you plant a forest, you do whatever, you sell the land, you change your business idea, whatever. What happens to, you've earned money on this, on these removals? Do you then give the money back at the end of it, or how does that work if you change your mind or you go bankrupt or something else happens to your idea along the way? Yeah.
So this is where we need to see how the liability rules and how the risk for that is shared between the one who finances it and the one who provides the carbon removals. And this is where I think we really need to look in other forms of contracts, and I think in a more long-term relationship between the two. Because what we want is really this high quality carbon removals. And I think if I, as a farmer, really change the way how I farm my land, I also want to know, okay, what happens with that? Who finances it? Because I don't want maybe necessarily to end it up with an oil company. But, and for that, I think there must be trust between those. And so this is why I think, in particular, for the startup phase of carbon removals, we will see more long-term contracts, like the way some companies are already doing it, with off-take contracts for the delivery of carbon removals in 10, 15 years. Because I think that will give the necessary trust to get that business off the ground.
Thanks. Frida, would you be able to address some of these? The NGOs or many NGOs are quite worried that this will lead to greenwashing, that it will potentially lead to a diversion of efforts to actually cut emissions, sort of a waste of time and energy doing this sort of thing. What's your thought on that?
Well, first of all, I would say I think it's a legitimate concern. It's a legitimate opinion, and I think it will be an important dimension of the discussions about this proposal, both in how we move it forward, co-legislators between, and also ultimately, at the end of the day, what we will do with these credits. And I think it was right what was mentioned in the beginning, that both looking at the IPCC conclusions, they point to the need for removals, but of course also a continued ambitious action on emission reductions. And I think that also brings us back to additionality questions as well, which I would link in terms of it should come in addition to our mitigation policies. So I think it's a relevant concern to have out in the open, and it's important to indeed discuss these things and engage with these questions. And we want to get it right. We don't want to repeat. I would assume we don't want to repeat some of the issues with the first generation carbon offsets. So let's build on what have been good examples so far, and let's learn from what was not so good. And hopefully in the end, by this, we can come up with a no-regret legislative framework in the end.
You mentioned that some of these things are being seen in Sweden. How does the system that you have there now work?
Yes, well, so first, well, in Sweden, I would say that we do work that falls in all these three categories. As Christian mentioned, we have active forest management as a way of making sure that the natural sinks increase, and a lot of activities that pertain to carbon farming. We have a growing bioeconomy where we try to replace fossil fuels and materials with renewable materials, which of course have one important component of also storing carbon for a longer time. And we also work actively to try to promote and develop bio-CCS in a good way. And in the way that we have constructed our national climate policy framework, we also make a clear distinction between emission reductions and what we call complementary measures, which can be, for instance, a bio-CCS or removing organic carbon from the atmosphere, but to ensure that we have a steady focus on emission reductions. And looking at the European climate law and the 2030 target, I think there we have a similar set of safeguards, if you will, by setting a cap to the amount of removals that can account for the current 2030 target. And this will, of course, also be a relevant dimension in the upcoming negotiations between co-legislators.
Great, thanks. We're getting a ton of questions, so I will address a couple of them right now. First one, can the Commission clarify the link with the EU ETS? Can the certificates be used to compensate ETS emissions?
No.
No. That clarifies that right away. So.
Completely separate, and we are very clear on that in the proposal.
Okay, grand. And can the Commission clarify the scope of the proposal? If only EU removals are covered, how will activities and certificates issued outside the EU be treated? This is from Kasia Wilk at Drax.
Yes. So this is only for removals in the EU. And I think this is also a bit of of a misconception on the availability of removals and how much international trading there will be in removals. Because if you get serious about being climate neutral, you probably need all your removals for yourself. And so what we are looking here into is how can we set the right conditions to start up the business for generating the removals that we want and need for climate neutrality in 2050 in Europe. And as I've also said several times, and I think what also more and more people realize, it's not so easy to generate those removals. Coming to those maybe 400 or 500 million tons of removals that we need in 2050, this will be a challenging and expensive journey.
The Commission mentioned that the carbon removal expert group will have its first meeting in January, which is once your presidency starts. When can we expect the finalized list of experts? And maybe you can also talk a little bit about what next steps we're expecting to see. And this question comes from Anna Kostov with Fleischmann-Hillard.
So let's keep the two things very separate. So there will be the co-decision procedure in Council, in Parliament. And at the same time, we already want to set up our expert group. So this will be around 70 participants, member states, NGOs, independent experts. That should already start to work on the technical work, on the methodologies that we need for permanent storage, for carbon farming, for carbon storage in products. With that, we are quite early. We are already doing it during the co-decision, so we already have a bit of trust that this will go through, because we see also the urgency and that we get ready and be ready then also for the following discussions on the financing. But that will be very separate from the co-decision process and will be nerdy technical work.
Maybe you could talk us through what's the timeline of what's supposed to happen during your presidency.
Yes, well, we look very much forward to begin the technical work and the negotiations in Council on this file. I think where we stand now, we would be looking to commencing work in early February and allow ministers to have a first exchange of views at the Environmental Council in March to give us a few flavors of how the proposal has been received in capitals. And then, of course, we will be in the hands of the member states as presidency to see how far we can take the proposal.
So just, I guess, legislatively, what timeline are we looking at? You've got the expert group. When do you expect that this will actually turn into legislation, turn into sort of a coherent set of policies?
I mean, we very much hope that we can do it under this mandate.
Okay.
So, and as you know, Parliament will close shop February, March 24, and I think that would be our ambition to have an agreement between the co-legislators before we go into the European elections, and where then maybe you will have a discussion about the climate law, about separate removal targets, and so on. And so I think there it would be very, very helpful if we already have established what are the principles for the monitoring, reporting, verification, to better understand the costs, risks, benefits of carbon removals.
We have a question from Anonymous. Would it make sense to have two separate certificate markets, a temporary one, which would require more discussion, and a permanent one with more clear-cut criteria?
I think it's still very open how we will finance carbon removals in the future. Will we finance them publicly? Will we finance them privately? And we are now very much in a startup phase, where I think we need both patient public support and patient private support. But then, of course, you can you can think about many different ways how to finance it. So would you, and then even at a bigger scale than carbon removals, how do we finance the transition, for example, in the whole agriculture forestry sector into a climate neutral or maybe even climate positive sector there? Should that happen within the sector? Or then how do we get in the heavy industry? What will be there the role of DACs and BECs? How we will finance those? Will we maybe continue with the Innovation Fund post-2030? What do you think then about the ETS? So there are a lot of big questions which all go into this, into this change into a new carbon economy where we won't have any more fossil fuels. And that we need to debate when we talk about our post-2030 policies, and carbon removals will be an essential part of that, but not the only one. So I think we will also talk much more about carbon capture and use.
Okay. Frida, I don't know if you'd be able to take this one, but there's a lot of questions here that ask about any linkages between carbon removals and CBAM, whether there's going to be overseas companies will be allowed to use carbon removals to adjust for CBAM. Generally, how the two potentially interact together.
If I were to try to attempt a kind of a logical sequencing of things, the CBAM regulation will hopefully be adopted and concluded very soon, before we even begin work on the carbon removals. So just by that, I would assume it would be difficult to combine the two. But
okay.
I think that's as good as a question as I can give, as speculatory as it might be.
One of the stories that we actually had on our site, there was a reaction, especially from smaller farmers, who were quite worried that that the scale of what they would need to do to get any benefit out of this, that their land holdings are simply too small. There were also worries that if this becomes an attractive scheme, that it might end up driving investment to buy land, which could have impacts on food production and on farming in general. What are the ideas to address some of those concerns?
No, I think very much to the contrary. I would hope, or maybe I'm even convinced, that what we're doing here can be really something empowering small farmers. But for that, we need to bring the information and advisory services to the guys, to the farmers. And I think with the digital technologies, remote sensing, other optical monitoring possibilities, what we've already pushed a lot for under LULUCF regulation, what you see also in the deforestation proposal, which is also going into geolocalization. We have great opportunities to empower farmers, foresters, to know their carbon balance and to give them much better possibilities to act and to improve. And I think this is what a lot of farmers, foresters want, because they say, we don't want to be a problem, we want to be part of the solution. And we need to enable that. And I would say in particular, if we get better at all the monitoring, and then we have solutions with the existing cooperatives, with new guys, advisory services that are going in there and group farmers together, I would see there a very large potential, and then the financing that can come out of our carbon removal certificates could really help in financing that transition that we need towards a climate neutral or climate positive bioeconomy.
Great, thanks. Frida, there's also been concerns from sustainable farmers about the issue of additionality, that they're already doing a lot of these things that need to be done, but then it's their normal way of functioning. So that my understanding is that then is more difficult to count it, because it's not a new thing that you're doing that will actually sequester more carbon? How are these things supposed to be addressed?
Well, how these things are supposed to be addressed would be up to co-legislators to decide.
All right, Christian?
Yeah, so what we are proposing is on what we call standardized baseline. And so where we want to go, and what we already said in the Sustainable Carbon Cycles communication of last year, we want to know by 28 the carbon balance for each land parcel in Europe. And we have a wealth of data. We have a wealth of data from the Common Agricultural Policy. And based on that, we can calculate the current practice for a certain field under certain climatic conditions. And this is what we are proposing as our baseline.
So you're going to send people across every square meter of land in Europe to test, and how do you do that? No. With remote sensing, you can do this much more efficiently.
Okay. And so what we know for every parcel in Europe, we know if it's farmed, how it has been farmed or forested over the last decades. We have all the data from the Common Agricultural Policy. We have a complete mapping of the whole area of Europe. We just need to put all of that data, all these different layers together, and then provide that information to farmers and foresters. Some member states are already doing this better, others have to catch up. But what is essential for carbon farming to work is that we get this information infrastructure right. And this can be really a step change for the agriculture sector. And we hope that with our certification, we can contribute to that.
Great. There's been a couple of questions about the impact of the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act. Helen Bray from Carbon Engineering asks, the IRA supports permanent technological removals. Will this have an impact on the timeline to implement the EU measures?
So we're just out with our latest call for the Innovation Fund that should support exactly those technologies. And we are there with 3 billion euros. We've never put out so much money. And so what we hope is to kind of have a dual strategy. We really look into the cost, benefits, risks of those technologies. We establish the MRV standards, and the Innovation Fund can be, or at least for us, the primary tool how we finance those first-of-a-kind projects that we want. So I think, contrary to the US, we do both. We do the financing, but we also improve the monitoring, reporting, verification, so that we exactly know what we are financing and that we are only financing the good things.
Great. Frida, this is a sort of slightly tricky question because Sweden has to be sort of the good faith arbiter during the presidency. What's your read of the reception that this is getting in capitals? Do you anticipate that it's going to be sort of wonky and very technical, or is there, because of the money and the at stake, that this is going to actually end up being a politically tricky file?
Well, I think the face value of the proposal is that it's rather technical, and there's a lot of emphasis, of course, on methodologies. But also in technical details, you have bigger political issues at hand. And I think this will lead to very intense and interesting negotiations on the proposal. Well, how the proposal has been received in capitals. I believe that the Commission will give also first official presentation at the Environmental Council in December. Potentially there will be some initial reactions there. Otherwise, I think the Environmental Council in March will also, as I mentioned earlier, give a good flavor of what will be the first initial reactions from member states.
And are you are you getting? You're saying next year you'll have a better sense of that. Are you already picking up signals of how things are likely to shake out?
Well, not from capitals yet, since we don't have the kind of formal negotiations ongoing. But of course, you can notice certain reactions from various stakeholders in media and so on. And I think, as often, the Commission's proposal are received with some praise and some concerns. And I wouldn't expect things to be different for this proposal as well.
I think we've got time for one more question, so I'll just take one from Wynand Stoffs of CMW. How will the overlap with LULUCF be managed?
So we see this as one of the enabling tools to realize our 310 target, and particularly focusing on those management practices which are more expensive, which are more risky, like the rewetting of peatlands, like agroforestry. So those that are not like the low-hanging fruits in the agriculture sector, but those that require a deeper transformation.
Great, thanks very much. And I'm afraid we have just run out of time. I'd like to thank both of you for agreeing to be on the panel. I think you've given us really good insight into, this is very early days on a policy which, if it works, will have an enormous impact. But I guess the idea is to do a huge amount of technical work and political work to ensure that this actually gets across the line and has the impact it's supposed to have. So I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank the audience, both here and online, for joining us in person, and the people who sent questions. There was tons of them. Couldn't address all of them, but I've done a lot of these panels, and I think this is actually the highest level of questions I've ever seen on a panel. So that gives some indication of the interest level in this subject. We'd love to get feedback from you. So please feel free to email us about the event. And the address is live@politico.eu. And you can check out our Politico events website for the latest lineup of events happening this year and next year. And that's www.politico.eu/events. And for those who are here in person, there is a networking reception that takes place right outside. Thanks again.
This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.